Thank you so much to Lindsay and to the Asia Society Policy Institute for inviting me here today. I'm such a great honor to be able to be with you, and it's been a long time since I've been in DC, and it's a very interesting time for US-China relations, so I'm excited to be talking about the subject with you. Just a little bit about myself before I begin. I grew up in Northern California, but I have a lot of family in China still, so I've been visiting very regularly since the early 90s. I was in China in the lead up to the Olympics in 2008, and I've now been based in Beijing for almost 7 years. So in the time that I've been in China, so much has changed. I remember when the Olympic torch relay came through my family's hometown of Xi'an, and everyone was so excited. Everyone was out in the streets, waving Chinese flags. They were calling it China's Coming Out Party. On August 8th, 2008, at 8 p.m., I watched the Olympic ceremony with some friends at an apartment in Xi'an. Did anyone here watch the ceremony? Yeah. You remember it? Okay. So, of course, we were all dazzled by Zhang Yimou's ceremony. We all remember the drummers, the scale, and the spectacle. But watching it at the time, I remember my friends, my Chinese friends who I was watching it with, weren't impressed at all. They were all worried about how the world would react. Would they like it? Was it grand enough? Was it big enough? Was it impressive enough? And by the end of the show, they had declared it a disaster. To them, it wasn't impressive enough for the rest of the world, and that was what mattered. I can't imagine that happening today. Most Chinese people I talk to, including those friends that I watched the ceremony with in 2008, aren't so worried anymore about what the rest of the world thinks about China. China is more influential, more sure-footed, more confident. It is now a global superpower. Some of us, including myself, think back to that time with a little bit of nostalgia and maybe even a little bit of embarrassment about our naivete. We had assumed that as China grew richer, political freedoms would inevitably follow. But the opposite has happened. China is moving steadily down the path of authoritarianism. Since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, we have seen the Chinese Communist Party seek to impose control over all aspects of society. Ideological training has been strengthened, human rights lawyers have been thrown in jail, NGOs have been forced to shut down, independent journalists have been squeezed out of the profession, internet controls have tightened, and security everywhere has been ramped up. For several years, I focused mainly on covering culture in China, which I loved because I got to meet some really fascinating people like Zhang Yimou and Matt Damon. But I also loved it not only because people in those circles tended to be more open and willing to talk to foreign media. But even in those circles, I've noticed a chill. Just take, for example, Bingbing. I mean, she's China's biggest movie star, and last year she just totally disappeared. Poof, gone. No one knows where she went. When she reappeared 3 months later, she came out with this formal apology, basically admitting to tax evasion and apologizing to the country for letting them down. In her apology, she wrote, "Without the party and the country, without the love of the people, there would have been no Fan Bingbing." Can you imagine that happening in the US? That's like the equivalent of Scarlett Johansson just vanishing from public view with no explanation and then reappearing suddenly and swearing her allegiance to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. So how does China continue to hold it together? It's a big question. In the past, people have talked about this unspoken bargain that exists between the party and the people. The party says, you agree not to challenge us, and we will give you economic opportunity and growth. But I think we're starting to realize that for many Chinese, the unspoken bargain is in fact more complicated than what we previously thought. It's more than just a simple exchange of economic prosperity for political acquiescence. There are other factors at work, and understanding these is, I think, key to gaining a better understanding of China today. Repression has always been a major factor. We have seen this taken to new extremes recently with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, where a vast human rights crisis has unfolded in recent years on an unprecedented scale. For the Uyghurs, China's turn toward authoritarianism has meant the devastation of entire families, cultural and religious practices, and ways of life. For many other Chinese, just the fear of repression is enough to keep them in line. Many still hold on to memories of famine and political upheaval from the Mao era. I've heard these arguments from my own family. China is not ready for democracy. There are too many people in China. Don't ask questions. Stay out of politics. Even those who want to push back often don't dare to because they have been made to believe that any effort to do so is futile. But beyond the repression and control, there are other pull factors at work here. It's something I've been thinking about a lot since last year when I was working with my colleagues on a series we did called China Rules, which took a broad historical look at China's rise to power. In the process of reporting, one of my editors asked me, why do people who can leave China choose to stay? Is there more to the story than just money, nationalism, and repression? That got me thinking about the many Chinese citizens I have met over the years who are still finding ways to carve out autonomy and meaningful opportunities in this landscape of deepening control. Because despite the growing top-down controls in China, there still remains a lot of give in the system. It's still a huge country with a vast bureaucracy, and while the red line is constantly shifting, there are people out there who are continually testing it, bumping up against it, and in many but not all instances, getting away with it. This is a key to understanding China. While the CCP is trying its best to blur the distinction between China, the country, the Chinese people, and the Chinese Communist Party, at the end of the day, it's important to remember that these are not the same. China may be a country ruled by authoritarians, but there is still space for individuals to push back, to make decisions, to exert agency, and find meaning in their own small ways. I've chosen a few examples which I think can give you a broad picture of how that is happening in different corners of society, and that is what I'd like to focus my talk on today. All right, so let's start with Chinese rap. Talk about another world. Has anyone here heard of the Higher Brothers? Yeah? Okay, a few of us. So they're the breakout stars of the Chinese rap world and have quickly built a fan base both at home and abroad. I met the Higher Brothers in 2017 in their hometown of Chengdu, which many of you may know for its famous spicy food and laid-back tea house culture. Hip-hop has been around in China for a while now. It started becoming popular in the 90s when access to the internet and pirated videos became more widespread. Some people found it through watching NBA mixtapes and others through watching breakdance or b-boy videos. Some of the more popular performers included Jay-Z, 50 Cent, and Eminem, who some Chinese refer to rather affectionately as Emu. There have been a number of Chinese rappers and hip-hop groups over the years, but most were forced to stay underground in large part due to government pressures. But only recently has China really caught on to this hip-hop fever in a big mainstream way, mostly because of this very popular rap competition show called The Rap of China, which had nearly 3 billion views in its first season. Chengdu, in particular, has been a hotbed of hip-hop, especially rap music. Some say it's because of the versatility of the dialect, which kind of sounds like this. Even if you don't speak Chinese, you can probably tell that Sichuanese is different because it's fun and bouncy and the rhythm is irregular, which makes it especially suited to rap music. So when I met the Higher Brothers, the guys, DZ No, Mello, Masue, and Sai P, were in their early 20s. They were covered in tattoos. Some of them had dreadlocks and grills. One of them had dyed purple hair. And there is an old Chinese proverb, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. And these guys were way out in Chengdu and they could not have cared less what was happening in the halls of power in Beijing. For them, like any rising rappers around the world, they had only a few concerns. How do I make good music? Where do I get girls? Where are my cigarettes? Who just dissed me and how do I get back at them? What's the latest street style and where are we going on tour? Music, fans, concerts, street style, rap battles, this was their life. But that kind of apolitical stance doesn't exactly fly in China where everything is political. When it comes to writing songs, every Chinese rapper has to consider government censorship. Rappers say that the list of unofficial list of sensitive topics is long. Politics, drugs, sex, violence, gangsters. So in other words, many of the themes that have come to define modern hip hop. I know some of you are thinking, if you can't rap about politics, sex, violence, drugs, gangsters, then what is there left to make music about? Well, here is where rappers in the Chinese Communist Party have a rare common interest, and that's money. Party officials so far have been mostly content with rappers to make music about making it to the top, which is of course one of the most enduring themes of hip hop. In Made in China, the Higher Brothers' most popular song, Ma Sui, boasts, "My chains, my new gold watch, made in China." The opportunities to rap about money and making it to the top have only grown in recent years as hip hop has gone mainstream. Now we hear words like freestyle and diss being used every day, and rap battles have gone viral online. As is often the case in China, once it started getting big, the industry was slapped with new regulations, making it more difficult for rap artists to work simply because there were more hoops that they had to jump through. In 2018, as the wave was cresting, the industry was somewhat predictably hit with what many called the hip-hop ban, which said, absolutely do not use actors whose heart and morality are not aligned with the party and whose morality is not noble. Do not use actors who are tasteless, vulgar, and obscene. Do not use actors whose ideological level is low and have no class. And do not use actors who have stains, scandals, and problematic moral integrity. Sounds about right. But as is often the case in China, the new rules have not really been applied. So the rap scene continues to thrive. Sure, rappers still complain about the increased controls, but they also say it has helped weed out some of those people who would have been just doing it for the fame. And they also say it has also encouraged the industry to slow down and think a little bit more about the origins of the music that they're making. Of course, many rappers are still constantly testing the boundaries of what is permissible. And like many artists, when faced with such challenges, they simply embrace them and use them for creative inspiration. So here's a refrain from the Higher Brothers song, Open That Stuff Up, from their latest album, 5 Star. You can see the usual themes, money and chest thumping about how great I am. And there are also references to VPNs, or virtual private networks, which many Chinese people use to get over the great firewall of internet censorship. I don't need a VPN. I can still watch YouTube. 1, 2, 3, we got 3 Airbnbs. Switch the GMC for a G63, OMG dollars, F with RMB. And I'm gonna stick with my day job. All right. So changing gears a little bit. I'd like to talk about another artist who has carved out a niche within the system in China in the face of immense pressures, and that is a Tibetan filmmaker, Pema Seddon. I first heard about Pema Seddon a few years ago when I was covering the Shanghai Film Festival. People were telling me about this emerging film scene in Tibet, and that was being led by this guy, Pema Seddon. I was surprised when I heard this. Tibet is, of course, one of the most sensitive subjects in China, along with other tea, such as Tiananmen and Taiwan and the top leader's wealth. And I knew that some Tibetan filmmakers had been harshly punished. In 2008, the Tibetan filmmaker Danda Wangchen co-directed a documentary called Leaving Fear Behind, in which he spoke with Tibetans who talked about their love for the Dalai Lama and also expressed their skepticism that the Beijing Olympics would improve their lives. Afterwards, Wangchen was sentenced to 6 years in jail and then spent 3 years under constant police surveillance before he fled to the US in 2017. So when I learned that there was someone who was making films about Tibet, and not just any films, but films that had been both approved by the Chinese government censors and also were celebrated by audiences abroad and Tibetans, I was very curious and I wanted to learn more. What I learned was that Pema Seddon, like many other filmmakers working in China today, has made a conscious decision to work from within the system, censorship, constraints, and all. Though all of his movies are set in Tibet or the Tibetan Plateau, they do not mention the Dalai Lama, and they rarely depict characters from the Han Chinese ethnic majority. He has been criticized for this. Some Tibetans abroad say he should use his platform to speak out about the increasingly repressive conditions at home, and others say that he benefits from a repressive system. They ask him, why do you get to travel freely when other Tibetans don't? But most Tibetans also love Pema Seddon's films because they are rare in that they show a Tibetan's view of Tibet. They don't exoticize it or show it as a mystical Shangri-La. And they don't depict it as a region of former serfs in need of liberation by the Chinese Communist Party, as is common in official Chinese propaganda. In depicting an unvarnished portrait of Tibet, the films are also deeply critical of the changes that are happening there, though not explicitly so. If you look at his movies, you can feel the anger and the despair over the loss of Tibetan traditions and cultures. For example, one of his best-known films is Tarlow, which is about a shepherd who lives in an isolated mountain home and makes a rare trip to the police station in town where he is told that he must register for a government-issued ID card. The shepherd doesn't understand why he needs to do that. He says, "I know who I am. Isn't that enough?" The film dives into the ultimate irony, which is that in the process of getting a government-issued ID card, the shepherd ultimately loses his own identity. Of course, what goes unmentioned is the cause of that loss of identity and tradition, which is encroaching modernization and central government policies that encourage ethnic assimilation among ethnic minorities. One Tibetan professor I talked to mentioned this very scene in Tarlow and said, "Every Tibetan knows what it feels like in that moment when the government makes it clear that you are one of its subjects." Despite these implicit scenes, Pema Seddon has managed to get official approval for all of his feature films, which is even more impressive when you consider the fact that as a Tibetan filmmaker making films about one of the most sensitive subjects in China, he is subject to increased government scrutiny, much more than any other Han Chinese filmmaker. After I learned about all the difficulties he faced just to get one movie made, I asked him the question that my editor had asked me a year ago: "Why do you stay?" And he said, "Where would I go? This is the land that I belong to." After talking to him more, I understood better why he takes the risks that he does to create his films. It's not easy, and he admitted there's a lot of topics that he can't go into, like Tibetan history. But I think when he asks himself, where can I make the most impact, the answer for him is China. It is by making films that can be seen not just by elite festival audiences, but also in China by Chinese, many of whom do not know what it's like as, in the day-to-day life of Tibetans, but also for Tibetans who before Pema Seddon very rarely got a chance to see themselves represented on the big screen. So Pema Seddon is an example of a person who, yes, is working within the system, but he's also someone who is working the system and playing the system to his advantage in order to achieve a broader goal, which is to tell Tibetan stories from a Tibetan point of view to the broadest possible audience. Of course, given the trajectory of China today towards stricter cultural controls, I've been wondering how long he'll be able to continue making these kinds of films. I asked him this, and he said that he didn't know either, but that he would continue to do so until he couldn't anymore. And then he said something that was really interesting to me. I had asked him about the central government policies encouraging assimilation, and as always, he was very cautious, and he admitted that he felt very helpless. But then he also said, when you are a relatively small subject and you encounter something with a greater power, of course you have no choice but to change and adapt, which I think sums up so well the sort of make it work, lemons and lemonade attitude of so many Chinese, and especially Chinese artists that I meet nowadays. Okay, so far we've talked about rappers who are navigating this buttoned-up landscape of Chinese officialdom, and we've also talked about a Tibetan filmmaker who is dancing with the red line to create films that don't depict an entire reality but are real in what they do depict. So now let's move on to another subject, one that is very close to my heart: Chinese women. I come from a long line of strong Chinese women, one of whom is my Chinese grandmother, who was born in Sichuan in the 1930s. She's very cute. She's about this tall. And she's only ever had 2 pieces of advice for me besides to study hard and get married. That is, 1, never get involved in politics, and 2, always make enough money so you never have to rely on a man. I've always thought the last piece of advice was very interesting. The others were pretty standard for a Chinese grandma. I think that she was channeling the era in which she came of age, when Marxists were talking about liberating women from patriarchal oppression, and Mao Zedong famously said, "Women hold up half the sky." Under Mao, the deep-rooted cultural belief that a woman's place belonged in the home was completely upended. Though women still faced persistent bias, they entered the workforce in record numbers. This is not because Mao and other male party leaders were raging feminists. Far from it. But the party needed women's productive labor. And for the first time, women were celebrated by the state for their work. Considering that just a few decades before, it was still common for many women to have their feet bound, this was a huge shift. But it changed when China began to embrace market reforms in the 80s. Though women now are living longer and are more educated than before and are making money than before, the gains that China has seen over the last 40 years have by far disproportionately benefited men. Whereas the party once wanted women to work, now they are facing a looming aging crisis and want women to have more babies. She has urged women to focus on their roles as wives and mothers, which is very different from what Mao was saying 70 years ago. And given this background, it's not surprising that we have seen a growing number of Chinese women dropping out of the workforce. And for those who do manage to stay working, official data shows that the gender wage gap continues to grow. At home, women also face growing discrimination. Women spend twice as much time as men do on housework. And because of the widespread custom of parents buying apartments only for their sons and not for their daughters, this has meant that many of the house deeds do not have the wife's name on it. And because of a court ruling in 2011, this has meant that millions of women who've gotten divorced have basically been cut out of the gains of what is arguably the largest boom in residential real estate wealth in history, simply because their names were not on the deeds. And these are just some of the ways in which Chinese women are losing ground. But as you might have guessed from the theme of this talk so far, they're not taking the losses lying down. The party's campaign to push women back to the home runs up against a related yet opposing force, the rise of Chinese feminism. The history of Chinese feminism stretches back more than a century. I wrote a long-belated obituary for one of these early Chinese feminists, Qiu Jin, who was a cross-dressing badass who loved wine and bomb making and spoke out very forcefully against the practices of arranged marriage and foot binding. Fast forward 100 years, and that feminist streak is still going strong. 2012 was a peak year for feminist activism in China. We saw feminist activists organize campaigns about issues like domestic violence awareness and also awareness about the long line for women public bathrooms. Recently, however, the party has tightened its grip on civil society. The space for activism, including feminist activism, has shrunk rapidly. We have seen the detention of feminist activists, a stifling of the nascent Me Too movement, and a crackdown across the board on women's organizations. And yet, there remains a sliver of space. Earlier this year, I wrote about a fascinating woman named Samu, who has been holding female orgasm workshops across China. You may be thinking, how are female orgasm workshops political? Well, they are when you consider that the Chinese government has essentially controlled women's bodies for the last 40 years. First through the one-child policy, which resulted in untold numbers of female infanticides, forced abortions, and forced sterilizations, and now through their push to get women to have more babies. If you wanted any more proof, you can just look at the People's Daily, the trustworthy People's Daily, which last year said in an editorial, to put it bluntly, the birth of a baby is not only a matter of the family itself, but also a state affair. So Samu's workshops align with a broader goal among Chinese feminists to help women take back control of their bodies and to learn better by learning their bodies better. There have been legislative victories as well, such as in 2016 when China passed a landmark anti-domestic violence law after years of campaigning by feminist activists. And then there are what I like to call the quiet feminists, the women who are resisting the government's pressures to get married and have kids. Last year, the marriage rate fell to its lowest rate since 2012, and the birth rate dropped to the lowest level in the 70-year history of the People's Republic of China. The divorce rate is climbing too, and women are initiating many of the cases. In Beijing in 2017, there was 1 divorce for every 2 marriages. Lu Pin, a prominent Chinese feminist activist, summed it up well when she said, "They aren't having kids and getting married. That's their way of pushing back." So I'd like to conclude today with my favorite story from my reporting on women in China, one that I think really captures the growing anger of women, but also more broadly, the enduring courage of individuals to speak up in the face of growing pressures. So the story happened on March 8th, which is also International Women's Day. Many of you may know it's a celebration of, well, it's supposed to be an international celebration of the women's rights movement. But in China, it's been co-opted by online retailers and transformed into a Black Friday-esque shopping holiday known as Goddess Day. So at one university campus in China this March, someone had put up 2 red Women's Day banners dedicated to the little fairy women. It's a patronizing tone you see often in advertising aimed at women in China, such as in these extra-wide, women-only pink parking spaces that I saw at a garage in Shanghai earlier this year. So back to that day, as women across China were browsing online sales in cosmetics and sportswear, one female university student in Beijing walked up to these 2 red banners and she lit them on fire. The photos quickly went viral before censors took them down. Later, after the girl was reprimanded by school administrators, she posted a message on her social media account to clarify her actions. She wrote, "Damn it! This day is not meant for consuming gender stereotypes." And then she concluded with the best non-apology apology I have seen in a very long time, and one that I think reflects so well the simmering defiance of not just women, but rappers and filmmakers and so many other Chinese living in China today. She wrote, "There was indeed a lack of concern for safety when I set the fire, so I apologize to my fellow students." I should have used scissors. That's it.